The original Dead Space is considered by many to be a classic, but it wasn't an overnight success. However, despite lower than expected initial sales, it would go on to sell over 3 million copies, and this would be enough for publisher EA to greenlight a sequel. Although sales of the first game would eventually become respectable, EA wanted to reach a much bigger audience with the next game. To help achieve this, developer EA Redwood Shores, now rebranded as Visceral Games, was given a massive development budget, and almost the same was spent on marketing. Reports on exactly how much it cost vary, but Dead Space 2 is still widely considered to be one of the most expensive games ever made. The first Dead Space set out to push the survival horror genre forward, while retaining the signature mechanics and atmosphere of the games and films it drew inspiration from. It succeeded, and while it still has a few issues, topping it wasn't going to be easy. I only played the first Dead Space earlier this year. I thought it was excellent for the most part, and if you haven't seen my review, there'll be a link in the description. My biggest complaint though is that it isn't scary the whole way through. The first couple of hours had my sphincter clenched tighter than a snare drum, but it failed to maintain the same level of intensity from beginning to end. It also leans pretty heavily on jump scares, and I've always preferred psychological horror over cheap thrills. So while my hopes for the sequel were high, I was skeptical that it would be any different. Dead Space 2 was an ambitious game. It had to be. To improve on what many consider to be a landmark title, the envelope had to be pushed, and push it they did. It has new mechanics, new weapons, tons of new enemies, larger and more diverse level design, more impressive visuals, and it has a multiplayer. Dead Space 2's creative director Wright Bagwell said in an interview with Gamasutra that they weren't content with simply making a bigger and prettier version of the first game. The team wanted to address the criticisms of the original and create something that was less repetitive and more terrifying. I'll come back to how scary it is later on, but in terms of it being less repetitious, they hit it out of the park. The first Dead Space suffers from having a lot of spaces that look similar. Mission design lacks variety too, with most essentially boiling down to go and fix a thing and try not to die in the process. The sequel addresses this with much more diversity in its level design and missions having you completing a multitude of different tasks. You also have more tools at your disposal, which means there are lots of new ways to dismember the hordes of enemies along the way. Dead Space 2 is the first game in the series to include an online multiplayer, and this was one of the strategies that was used to attract a bigger audience. Frank Gibbo, the former president of EA Games, said this of single-player games at the time: "I think that model is finished. Online is where the innovation and the action is at." Looking back, it's easy to see that this was also how they planned to monetize the game long term, at least on console. It was pretty common for single-player focused games at the time to include a multiplayer mode, and while Dead Space 2's PvP reviewed well enough, it has little impact on the story, so this review will focus purely on the single-player experience. Dead Space 2 is set 3 years after the events on the Ishimura. Isaac wakes up to find himself institutionalized in a colony called the Titan Station, also known by the locals as the Sprawl. You soon discover that a second marker is involved, and once again the human inhabitants have transformed into disgruntled meat puppets. If you haven't played the first game, then what the hell man, seek out a copy and play it immediately. But yeah, if for some reason you haven't played the first game, or it's been a while, there's a previously on which does a pretty good job at bringing you up to speed. Just like the first game, the story centers around the supernatural powers of the marker and the various organizations trying to control it. You also find out some new information about what happened on the Ishimura. There are tons of text and audio logs littered throughout the Sprawl that dig into its history, the Church of Unitology, and the expanded universe. I highly recommend that you consume all of them, as well as taking your time to check out the various signs and screens along your travels. They do a good job at filling in the backstory, but more importantly, they help build atmosphere. I hate to keep referencing Alien Isolation, but I'm going to because I'll talk about it any chance I get, but I wouldn't be surprised if Creative Assembly took some inspiration from the Sprawl when designing the Sevastopol. Both of them have this Paul Verhoeven-esque dark humour and cynicism, particularly in the advertising that you'll see throughout the station. A big difference to the first game is that Isaac is no longer a silent protagonist. Having him talk gives his character more agency in the story, and it also helps you feel more involved in what's going on. I have to admit, I really didn't like his voice at first. In my head, I had always pictured it being more gravelly and manly, a bit like Kratos. He doesn't speak a whole lot, but his dialogue is well written, and he even cracks a couple of jokes that made me chuckle. So eventually I grew to accept that this is just how he sounds.
Isaac, no! It's a really bad idea.
Well, stick around. I'm full of bad ideas.
I definitely thought the story was more interesting this time around. It manages to expand on the universe without giving unnecessary explanations of ideas or concepts presented in the original, something that so many sequels fall victim to. The supporting cast actually has some interesting characters, and although it's lighter in tone, I didn't think this ruined the atmosphere. The ending is fantastic too, a little predictable sure, but definitely satisfying. This game doesn't fuck around, it drops you straight in the deep end with no weapons or way to defend yourself. It's hard too, like holy shit is it hard. This section in particular can go die in a fire. I played it on Survivalist, which is the second hardest of the 4 default difficulties, and needless to say, I died in the first 30 seconds. I've read and watched a lot of reviews of this game, and a common complaint is that there are too many resources. Playing it on Survivalist felt like the right balance to me, with plenty of situations requiring me to get creative in order to survive. Zealot, which is the hardest default setting, reduces resource drops even further, so if resource scarcity is your bag, then this might be the option for you. A minor issue I had with the first game was that it was a little too forgiving with its checkpoints and save stations. Dead Space 2 does have less of both, but it's not a dramatic difference. There is actually a way to disable checkpoints completely, but it comes with a pretty significant caveat. When you finish the game on any setting, you unlock hardcore mode, which does remove them. The only problem is, this mode is kind of reserved for insane people. It limits you to only 3 saves for the entire campaign, and you can't play it as a new game plus, meaning you can't bring your existing gear from a previous playthrough. Now, I would have preferred if Zealot also removed checkpoints, but admittedly this is a minor gripe. Kinesis has a much bigger emphasis in this game. It's much faster and can reach further this time, and each area is denser with items than the Ishimura was. So much so that some rooms are completely cluttered with crap that you have to move out of the way to get where you're going. This makes navigating tight spaces in a hurry more challenging, but it does give you more options in combat, with lots of pointy items that you can pick up and spear enemies with. Combat is similar to the first game. Remember how I said in my Dead Space review that it was a bit like Doom in the sense that each encounter is a puzzle? Dead Space 2 dials this concept up even further, and figuring out which enemies to prioritize, which ones can be used offensively, and what weapons are the most effective for each scenario is even more essential this time around. On top of that, you've got a number of resources to manage. Items in the environment are limited, depending on the difficulty of course, so you rely heavily on the items dropped by enemies. This means you're constantly having to balance offense and defense to make sure you never run out of ammo, health or stasis. There are plenty of new enemy types, and damn if the game doesn't throw a shitload of them at you all at once. This demands a ton of quick thinking and strategy, with some of the more difficult scenarios requiring more than a few attempts. These little sons of bitches are a perfect example of how combat requires you to keep track of a number of threats and how easy it is to become overwhelmed. All the original weapons return, including the OG plasma cutter, so long as you have a Dead Space 1 game save. There are 4 new weapons too, and each one feels unique and satisfying to use. The Javelin is my personal favourite. It fires metal rods with enough force that they can pin enemies to walls. You can then fry them with an electrical charge using the alternate fire mode. You can get pretty creative with it by firing it at surfaces and using it for crowd control, and this plays nicely into the MacGyver style combat philosophy. You're not just mindlessly emptying magazine after magazine into enemies, you really need to use every available weapon, resource and object in the environment to stand a chance. For the most part, I think all of the new enemies are excellent and complement the existing suite of nasties. Unlike the first game, there aren't any boss fights with giant enemies. There are some tough larger enemies, but nothing on the same scale as the bosses from the first game. I think this was the right choice. I thought the big loping bosses felt out of place next to the otherwise nimble necromorphs. To break up the combat, there are a number of puzzles to solve. These range from quick and easy tasks such as hacking terminals, to more complex problems that require a bit more lateral thinking. Some of these are pretty clever too. I don't want to spoil any of them, but you really need to think outside the box and scour the environment for clues of what to do. Now, there are a couple of things I didn't enjoy. The crawling sections, for example, feel really superfluous. They don't require any skill, you can't fail at them, and they don't add anything to the experience. If I had to take an uneducated guess, I'd say that they've mostly been used to hide loading times. Thankfully, they don't last very long and there isn't too many of them. If I had to pick one thing above everything else that I would change, it would be the amount of inventory space you have. There's actually very little reason to jump into your inventory unless you're at a store. There was only one instance in my entire playthrough where I didn't have room for something and had to backtrack to a store so I could move items around. The Resident Evil games have always nailed this component, giving you just enough space to carry the essentials, meaning you often had to forego one item over another. This restriction adds an element of strategy and risk, and is unfortunately completely absent in Dead Space 2. You still have to choose between spending your credits on making yourself less squishy or increasing your DPS, but there isn't really any inventory management other than choosing which medpack to use. The last thing I'm not crazy about is the QuickTime events. These were pretty common 10 years ago, and they're one of the few elements which give away the game's age. To be fair, there aren't that many of them, but you will have to mash A, or the equivalent button, a whole lot on the harder settings. Overall though, the moment-to-moment gameplay feels like a step up from the first game. You never spend too much time on any one task, there's lots of mission variety, combat is as much about strategy as it is about fast execution, and it's challenging without feeling cheap or unfair. It's hard to believe that there's only 3 years between Dead Space 1 and 2. The leap in quality between the two is massive. The level design is really incredible and packed with detail. Like, look at this roof. Someone probably spent a lot of time modelling this roof detail, and I reckon that most people will probably walk right through this room without ever looking up. Everything is just sharper too, and there's heaps of little animations that help give the presentation a polished look. Like the way Isaac reloads the plasma cutter, or how when you spam the stomp button he starts shouting expletives. The various rigs look great, and I like how the animation when changing into them is even more epic now. Dynamic lighting once again plays a big role, and the quality of shadows seems to be improved across the board. The way objects you pick up cast shadows against walls in particular is awesome. I criticised the UI in the original, and while it hasn't been overhauled here, it has been simplified and made a bit more intuitive. The UI for weapons in your inventory, for example, now looks like a D-pad to remind you where they are on the controller. The locator has been improved too. Not only is it clearer to understand, but it can be set to different points of interest. Sound design is unsurprisingly on point. Jason Graves, who was the composer for the first game, returned for the sequel, and the results are just as impressive. It uses a dynamic system which changes depending on what's happening, and it's every bit as effective as the original. This is definitely a game to play with a decent pair of cans, although if you want the best audio experience you'll need the PS3 version, because it's the only system that got an uncompressed 7.1 audio track. Where the first game wore its influences on its sleeve, the second game parades around wearing them like a homemade suit. This might sound like I'm being facetious, but I mean this as a compliment. There are elements, such as this room, which are almost lifted directly from the source material. It's pure fan service in the best possible way, and seeing this stuff in game and being able to interact with it is a sci-fi horror fan's wet dream. So I've got what I'm guessing is going to be an unpopular opinion, but I don't think this game is all that scary. At least not when compared to the first game. If you haven't played the first game, then yeah, you're in for a wild ride, but if you have, then you've seen a lot of this before. I criticised the original Dead Space for repeatedly using the same bag of tricks to frighten you, which made it less scary the more you played. Unfortunately, Dead Space 2 relies on many of the same tricks, and there's less of the quiet moments that made the first game so suspenseful. Another issue preventing it from being as scary is that the level design and story are often trying to do different things at the same time. For example, in one scenario, your friends are screaming at you to come quickly because they're about to be eaten alive. But at the same time, you're presented with a save station and a store. So, on one hand, you're being told that you need to act quickly, but on the other, you're being told to take as much time as you like. This completely kills any sense of urgency and it lowers the stakes because regardless of what happens on the other side of that door, you just saved your progress. Again, I think this is where less save stations and fewer checkpoints would have made it a better game. What it does attempt to do differently is lean more heavily on psychological terror. Throughout the game, Isaac has these hallucinations. He appears to be suffering from some kind of psychosis, and his perception of reality and insanity is constantly being blurred. These episodes are supposed to be unsettling, but they really didn't land for me. I'm not trying to boast either, like, look at me and my bad self, I'm totally not scared by the glowing orifice lady. I just think that horror games have evolved a lot since 2011, and while it may have been effective back then, when you compare it to something like PT, there's really no competition. Don't get me wrong, it still has its moments, and there were definitely times where I wanted to turn my headset down, particularly at the beginning of Chapter 10, but overall I found it to be a less suspenseful experience than the original. Unlike the first game, performance across the PS3 and 360 is near identical. Both systems target a 720p resolution and 30 frames per second, and both hand in a solid result. That being said, the PS3 version does have a few advantages outside of the visuals. The first is that Blu-ray allows the entire game to be on a single disc. Seeing as you're only going to need to swap the disc once during the campaign, this isn't really a big deal though. What is a literal game changer is the inclusion of uncompressed 5.1 and 7.1 audio. This is a substantial improvement over the 360 stereo audio, and reason enough to choose the PS3 version if you have a surround system or surround headphones. In Power Regions, the PS3 Collector's Edition also came with a HD version of Dead Space Extraction. This was originally a Wii game, and the PS3 has updated visuals and move support. It's worth noting that it wasn't on the disc, meaning you had to download it. So if you're looking to pick up the Collector's Edition second-hand, it may not come with a valid download key, but it is still available to purchase on the PSN if you're super keen. Now, it will run on the Xbox One using backwards compatibility, but sadly there aren't any enhancements for it, like an improved frame rate. Seeing as the performance is already very solid on the 360, there's little reason to play it on the newer hardware, unless of course that's your only option. But what about PC, I hear you ask? On PC you can run the game at up to 2160p, and it has both a 60Hz and a 120Hz option, although apparently 120Hz does some crazy shit to the physics. There's also a bunch of other graphics options, including anti-aliasing and high quality shadows. PC has the advantage of basically eliminating load times too, although the load times on consoles aren't exactly horrendous. Oddly, there's no 5.1 or 7.1 audio, but it does have a 5.0 option. The PC version does come with a bunch of the DLC, but unfortunately it never received the Severed campaign expansion. Also, you'll probably want to turn off the DLC before your first playthrough, unless you intend on playing it with some serious training wheels on. So, PS3 is the version to get if you want to experience it with the most immersive and clear audio, and PC is the version to get if resolution, frame rate, and the ability to tweak settings is more important. There's nothing wrong with the Xbox versions, that's what you've been watching in this video, but you do give up surround sound, which in a game like this is a pretty big deal. Even though Dead Space 2 sold over 2 million copies and outsold the original 2-1, it still failed commercially according to EA. Despite receiving an overwhelmingly positive critical reception, this lack of commercial success would have a big impact on the third game's direction, as EA continued to pursue a larger audience. Personally, I think it's an excellent sequel. It outdoes the first game in almost every way, and it's a rare example of a studio being given both the budget and freedom to do what they want. It does have a few problems, but overall I think its achievements greatly outweigh its flaws. It is slightly shorter than the first game, but if you're into second runs, there's plenty of replay value. It's unlikely that you'll max out every weapon and rig upgrade on your first playthrough, and the higher difficulties provide substantially more challenge. If you enjoyed the first game or are simply looking for a really good survival horror/horror action, then I can't recommend this enough. Anyway, I appreciate your time, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, a like is always appreciated. Subscribe if you want more of these types of videos, but otherwise, see you later.